Mar Ellison hadn't been touched by a man in 15 years. She'd stopped believing anyone still saw her, stopped imagining warmth might ever reach through the cold. Then Caleb Rowan, the man who'd never spoken more than 3 words to her in a single breath, showed up at her door with an invitation that made no sense. Dinner. Just the two of them. And when she finally sat across from him in the lamplight of his ranch, what he said next tore every assumption she'd ever made about her life straight down to the bone. Some truths don't whisper, they explode. If you're ready to see how a woman the world forgot became impossible to ignore, stay with me until the end. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see just how far this story travels. Mara Ellison had learned not to expect much from Tuesdays. They came and went like everything else in Cedar Hollow. Dusty, predictable, forgettable. She'd wake before dawn, same as always, pull her hair back without bothering to check the mirror, and start the day with chores that had long stopped feeling like choices. The chickens didn't care if she was tired. The stove didn't wait for motivation. Life kept moving whether she was ready or not. She was 32, though most people in town would have guessed older. Not because she looked worn exactly, more like she'd faded into the background so completely that no one had bothered to look at her closely in years. Her mother's long illness had done that. 5 years of slow dying, 5 years of Mara's youth spent in a cramped room that smelled like camphor and regret, watching the only person who'd ever needed her slip away one labored breath at a time. When it finally ended, Mara had expected relief, maybe even a strange kind of freedom. What she got instead was silence. The house felt too big, the town felt too small, and the version of herself she'd imagined waiting on the other side of grief, the one who'd start fresh, maybe meet someone, build something new, never showed up. She was just here, still in the same wooden house on the edge of Cedar Hollow, still doing the same routines, still invisible. Morning, Mara. She glanced up from the dry goods she was sorting at Whitman's general store. Samuel Whitman stood behind the counter, his tone polite in the way people used when they didn't really see you. She'd been coming here 3 times a week for 2 years. He still said her name like he had to remind himself what it was. "Morning," she said back. He nodded and returned to his ledger. That was it. The entire interaction. She gathered her flour and cornmeal, paid, and left without another word exchanged. Outside, the street was scattered with the usual faces. Men loading wagons, women walking in pairs, children darting between storefronts. No one looked at her. No one ever did. Mara had made peace with it, mostly. She told herself it didn't matter, that she didn't need to be noticed, that wanting something more than survival was a young woman's dream, and she wasn't young anymore. But some days the peace felt thin. She was halfway home when she saw him. Caleb Rowan. He stood near the livery, one hand resting on the saddle of his horse, talking to Ed Ferris in that low, clipped way he had. Caleb didn't waste words. Never had. He was the kind of man who could say more with a look than most people managed in a full conversation, and he carried himself like someone who'd decided a long time ago that the world wasn't owed an explanation. Mara had known him for years. Everyone in Cedar Hollow knew Caleb. He ran a cattle ranch north of town, kept to himself, showed up when he needed supplies and disappeared right after. He wasn't unfriendly exactly, just unreachable. Built like he'd been carved out of something harder than the rest of them, with dark hair that always looked like it needed cutting and eyes that didn't miss much. She'd never spoken to him beyond the occasional nod in passing. There'd never been a reason to. So when those eyes shifted and landed on her, direct, unblinking, her first instinct was to look away. But she didn't. Something in the way he was staring held her in place. Not aggressive, not even particularly warm, just deliberate, like he'd been waiting for her to notice him noticing her. Her pulse kicked up for no reason she could name. Then Ed said something and Caleb's attention snapped back. The moment broke. Mara turned and kept walking, her heartbeat louder than it had any right to be. She told herself it didn't mean anything. 2 days later, he showed up at her door. Mara had been elbow-deep in bread dough when the knock came, firm, certain, nothing tentative about it. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door, already assuming it was a peddler, or maybe one of the church women with another casserole she didn't ask for. It wasn't. Caleb Rowan stood on her porch, hat in hand, expression unreadable. For a second, neither of them spoke. "Miss Ellison," he said finally. His voice matched the rest of him, low, rough-edged, like it didn't get used much. "Mr. Rowan." She tried to keep her voice steady. Failed slightly. "Can I help you? Hope I'm not intruding." "No, no, you're not." Another pause. He shifted his weight, and for the first time since she'd known of him, Caleb Rowan looked almost uncertain. "I came to ask if you'd have dinner with me," he said. "Tomorrow evening, at my place." Mara blinked. She must have misheard. That was the only explanation that made sense. "I'm sorry, what?" "Dinner," he repeated, slower this time, like maybe she hadn't understood the word. "Just the two of us, if you're willing." Her mind went blank. Then it went into overdrive. This didn't happen. Men like Caleb Rowan didn't notice women like her, and they certainly didn't show up out of nowhere with invitations that sounded like something out of a story she'd stopped believing in. I don't understand," she said, and immediately hated how small her voice sounded. "Not asking for much," Caleb said. "Just a meal. A conversation. Your company." "Why?" The question came out sharper than she intended, but she needed to know, needed to understand what angle this was, what joke she'd wandered into. Caleb met her eyes again, and this time there was something in his expression she couldn't name. Something that looked almost like pain. "Because I've wanted to ask for a long time," he said quietly, "and I'm done waiting." Mara's breath caught. She should have said no. Should have thanked him politely and closed the door and gone back to her dough and her safe, predictable life. Should have protected herself from whatever this was. Instead, she heard herself say, "What time?" She regretted it immediately. The moment Caleb left, after giving her directions to his ranch and telling her 6 o'clock, Mara shut the door and pressed her back against it, heart hammering. What had she just agreed to? She didn't know this man, didn't know what he wanted or why he'd chosen now, of all times, to see her. And the idea of sitting across from someone like him, someone substantial, someone real, made her feel like she was about to walk off a cliff she couldn't see the bottom of. But she'd said yes, and part of her, some reckless, half-forgotten part, wanted to see what happened next. The next evening came too fast. Mara changed clothes 3 times before settling on a simple blue dress that didn't make her feel like she was trying too hard. She left her hair down, reconsidered, pinned it back, took the pins out again, stared at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back, not because she looked different, but because she couldn't remember the last time she'd cared. The ride to Caleb's ranch took 20 minutes. The sun was sinking low, painting the hills in shades of amber and rust, and the air smelled like dust and summer grass. Mara's hands were damp on the reins. When the ranch came into view, she almost turned back. It was bigger than she'd expected, solid, well-kept, the kind of place that spoke of years of hard work and no shortcuts. Caleb was waiting outside, leaning against the porch rail, and when he saw her, he straightened. "You came," he said, and there was relief in his voice. "I said I would." "I know. Still wasn't sure you'd mean it." Mara dismounted, her legs unsteady. Caleb stepped forward and took her horse without asking, tying it off with quick, practiced hands. "Come on in," he said. "Everything's ready." Inside, the house was simpler than she'd imagined. Clean, sparse, functional. A table was set near the window, 2 plates, 2 glasses, a pot of something that smelled like stew. "You cooked?" she asked, surprised. "Don't sound so shocked." There was the faintest hint of a smile. "I've been living alone a long time. Had to learn." They sat. Caleb served the food, beef stew, bread, nothing fancy but clearly made with care. For a few minutes, they ate in silence, the kind that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't unbearable either. Then Caleb set down his fork and looked at her. "I need to tell you something," he said. Mara's stomach tightened. "All right." He took a breath, and for the first time since she'd met him, Caleb Rowan looked genuinely nervous. "I've known you 15 years, he said. "Since the day you moved to Cedar Hollow. You were 17, I was 22. And I've been in love with you since then." The room tilted. Mara stared at him, certain she'd misheard, certain this was some kind of mistake. "That's not possible," she whispered. "It is." "You never—" Her voice cracked. You never even spoke to me. I know. Then how? Because I was a coward. The words came out rough, like they'd been stuck in his throat for years. Because I told myself you were too young, and then I told myself you were grieving, and then I told myself it was too late. I made up every excuse I could think of not to walk up to you and say what I should have said a decade ago. Mara couldn't breathe. Why now? She asked, and her hands were shaking. Why tell me now? Caleb leaned forward, and the look in his eyes was so raw it hurt to hold. Because I can't stand it anymore, he said. Watching you walk through town like you don't exist, like you don't matter. You matter, Mara. You've always mattered. And if I don't tell you now, I'm going to spend the rest of my life regretting it. Tears blurred her vision. She blinked them back, but they came anyway. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Caleb's voice gentled. I just needed you to know. But Mara did have something to say. 100 things. 1,000. She opened her mouth, and the words that came out surprised even her. I thought I was invisible. Caleb shook his head slowly. You've never been invisible. Not to me, but... They talked for hours. Not about love, not directly, but about everything else. About her mother's illness and the weight of those years. About Caleb's ranch and the isolation he'd built around himself. About Cedar Hollow and the way small towns could make you feel both trapped and safe at the same time. Mara learned that Caleb had lost his parents young, that he'd built his life from nothing, that he didn't trust easily and didn't open up often. She learned that he noticed things, small things, like the way she always bought the same cornmeal at Whitman's, or the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. And slowly, impossibly, she started to believe him. Not because he was saying the right things, but because the way he looked at her, like she was something worth seeing, felt too real to be a lie. When the night grew late and Mara finally stood to leave, Caleb walked her outside. The stars were thick overhead, the kind of sky you only got this far from anywhere. Can I see you again? He asked. Mara looked at him, this man who'd just upended her entire understanding of her own life, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Yes, she said. And when he smiled, just a small, barely there curve of his mouth, it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She rode home in a daze. Her mind wouldn't settle, kept circling back to the impossible thing Caleb had said, the impossible thing she'd agreed to. 15 years. How did someone love in silence for that long? And more terrifying, what was she supposed to do now that she knew? Because the truth was, Mara Ellison had spent so many years convinced she didn't deserve this. Didn't deserve to be wanted, to be loved, to be seen, that the idea of actually having it felt like standing at the edge of something enormous and irreversible. She could walk away, protect herself, go back to the safety of invisibility. Or she could step off the edge and trust that Caleb Rowan would catch her. By the time she reached her house, she still didn't know which choice scared her more. But she knew one thing for certain. She was done being invisible. The next morning, Mara woke with Caleb's words still ringing in her ears. 15 years. And the weight of them felt different in daylight. Less like a dream, more like a debt she didn't know how to repay. She went through her routines on autopilot, fed the chickens, swept the porch, made coffee she barely tasted. But her mind kept drifting back to the way he'd looked at her across that table, like she was the only solid thing in the room. It terrified her, not because she didn't believe him, though part of her still couldn't quite wrap around the idea that someone like Caleb Rowan had spent 15 years carrying her name in his chest, but because believing him meant she had to do something about it, had to decide if she was brave enough to reach back. And Mara hadn't been brave in a long time. By mid-morning, she forced herself into town. She needed supplies, needed the distraction, needed to prove to herself that the world hadn't shifted just because one man had finally said her name out loud. Cedar Hollow looked the same as always. Dust hung in the air. Wagons rattled past. The same faces moved through the same rhythms they'd been moving through for years. But Mara felt different walking through it. She kept her head down as she crossed the street toward Whitman's, but she could feel eyes on her. Or maybe she was imagining it. Maybe no one was looking at all. Maybe that was the problem. She'd spent so long being invisible that she didn't know how to tell the difference between being seen and just hoping she was. Mara. She stopped, turned. It was Dorothy Carver, one of the church women who'd brought casseroles after her mother died. Dorothy was pleasant enough in that overly sweet way people got when they wanted something from you but didn't want to ask directly. "Morning, Dorothy." "I saw you riding out yesterday evening," Dorothy said, and there was a question buried in the statement. "Headed north?" Mara's stomach tightened. Of course someone had seen her. In a town this size, privacy was a fiction people told themselves. "Just visiting a friend," she said evenly. "Oh?" Dorothy's smile sharpened. "I didn't know you had friends out that way." "Guess I do now." It came out colder than she'd intended, but Mara didn't take it back. She nodded politely and kept walking, leaving Dorothy standing there with her half-formed gossip still caught in her throat. Inside Whitman's, Mara gathered what she needed: cornmeal, salt, a small tin of lard, and brought it to the counter. Samuel Whitman rang her up without comment, same as always, and she was about to leave when the door swung open behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Caleb's presence filled a room in a way most people's didn't. Quiet, but impossible to ignore. "Rowan," Samuel said, nodding. "What can I do for you?" "Need fencing wire," Caleb said. "And nails. Maybe 20 pounds. "I'll get it sorted." Mara stood frozen at the counter, her purchases still sitting in front of her. She could feel Caleb's gaze on her back, steady and unblinking, and every nerve in her body screamed at her to move. But she didn't. Instead, she turned. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or just the acknowledgement that last night had happened and couldn't be undone. "Miss Ellison," Caleb said, his voice low enough that Samuel probably couldn't hear. "Mr. Rowan." He stepped closer, just a half step, and lowered his voice further. "You all right?" "Fine." "You sure?" She wanted to say yes, wanted to brush him off and walk out and pretend none of this was happening. But the way he was looking at her, concerned, careful, like she was something fragile he didn't want to break, made lying impossible. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. Caleb nodded like that was the answer he'd expected. "You want to talk?" "Not here." "Then come by tonight, same time." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a command either. Just an offer, simple and direct, the way everything about Caleb seemed to be. Mara hesitated, then nodded. "All right." Caleb's expression softened, just barely. "Good." Samuel returned with the wire and nails, and the moment broke. Mara gathered her things and left without another word, but she could feel Caleb's eyes on her all the way to the door. She told herself she wouldn't go. Told herself it was too soon, too much, too dangerous to let herself fall into something she didn't understand. But when evening came and the sun started sinking toward the horizon, Mara found herself saddling her horse anyway. The ride to Caleb's ranch felt shorter this time, familiar, even though she'd only done it once before. When she arrived, he was waiting on the porch again, same as last time, except tonight he wasn't leaning. He was standing, arms crossed, watching her approach with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Wasn't sure you'd come," he said as she dismounted. "Neither was I." He took her horse again, tied it off, and gestured toward the house. "Come on, I made coffee." Inside, the table was clear this time. No dinner set out, just 2 mugs and a pot still warm on the stove. Caleb poured for both of them and sat down across from her, same spot as before. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Mara said, "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "This." She gestured vaguely between them. "Whatever this is." Caleb took a slow sip of his coffee, then set the mug down. "You think I do?" "You seem like you've got it figured out." He laughed, short, humorless. "I've spent 15 years not saying a damn word to you, Mara. That's not having it figured out, that's the opposite." "Then why now?" The question had been gnawing at her all day. What changed? Caleb looked away, jaw working. When he finally answered, his voice was rough. "I saw you in town a few months back. You were carrying something, groceries maybe, and you dropped one of the bags. Everything spilled, and you just stood there. Didn't ask for help, didn't look around, just knelt down and started picking it all up by yourself, like you didn't expect anyone to notice." Mara remembered. She'd dropped a sack of flour outside the mercantile. It had split open, white powder everywhere, and she'd cleaned it up alone while people walked past without stopping. "And?" she said quietly. "And it broke something in me," Caleb said. "Watching you act like you didn't matter. Like nobody gave a damn if you were there or not, because I did. I've always given a damn. And I couldn't stand watching you disappear anymore. Mara's throat tightened. You don't even know me. I know enough. You know what you've seen from a distance. That's not the same thing. Then let me know more. Caleb leaned forward, and the intensity in his eyes pinned her in place. That's all I'm asking, Mara. Let me see you, the real you, not the version you think you have to be. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that there wasn't anything worth seeing, but the words wouldn't come, because part of her, some deep starving part, wanted exactly what he was offering. I don't know if I remember how to let someone in, she said finally. Then we'll figure it out together. What if I can't? Then we'll figure that out too. It was such a simple answer, so certain, like failure wasn't something that scared him. Mara looked down at her hands, rough and worn from years of work, and tried to imagine what it would feel like to be seen the way Caleb said he saw her. I'm not easy, she said quietly. I'm used to being alone, used to not needing anyone. And I don't know if I can just... I'm not asking you to change, Caleb interrupted. I'm asking you to trust me enough to try. She met his gaze, and the raw honesty there made her chest ache. Why me? She whispered. Why not someone younger, someone who hasn't spent the last 10 years disappearing? Because you're the one I want. Caleb's voice didn't waver. Always have been. And in that moment, Mara made a choice. Not a loud one, not dramatic, just a quiet shift inside herself, like a door she'd kept locked finally creaking open. Okay, she said. Caleb blinked. Okay? I'll try. The relief that washed over his face was so genuine it almost hurt to look at. That's all I'm asking, he said softly. They started slow. Over the next few weeks, Mara found herself at Caleb's ranch more often than not. Sometimes he'd invite her for dinner, sometimes she'd just show up, and he'd pour coffee without asking why she was there. They talked about everything and nothing, her mother's final days, his years building the ranch, the strange loneliness of Cedar Hollow despite being surrounded by people. Caleb was easier to be around than she'd expected. He didn't push, didn't demand, just existed beside her in a way that felt steady, solid, like ground that wouldn't shift no matter how hard she stepped. But Mara still struggled. There were nights she'd ride home and convince herself this was a mistake, that she was too broken, too closed off, too used to being alone to ever let someone in. She'd lie awake and list all the reasons it wouldn't work, all the ways she'd eventually disappoint him. And then she'd see him again, and he'd look at her like none of that mattered. One evening, about a month in, they were sitting on his porch watching the sunset when Caleb said, "You ever think about leaving?" Mara glanced at him. Leaving where? Cedar Hollow, this whole area, starting over somewhere new. She considered it. Sometimes, but I don't know where I'd go. Anywhere you wanted. That's the problem. I don't know what I want. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if I told you I want you to stay?" Her heart kicked. Here? With me. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything he'd said before. Mara's first instinct was to deflect, to make a joke or change the subject or do anything but sit with the enormity of what he was suggesting. But she forced herself to stay still. "You mean that?" she said slowly. "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." "Caleb, we've only been 15 years, Mara." His voice was firm but not harsh. "I've known what I wanted for 15 years. I'm not guessing. I'm not hoping. I'm sure." But I'm not. The confession spilled out before she could stop it. "I don't know if I'm sure about anything." "That's all right." "How is that all right?" "Because I'm sure enough for both of us." Caleb turned to face her fully, and the certainty in his expression was staggering. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Mara. You just have to let me love you while you do." Tears blurred her vision. She blinked them back, but one escaped anyway, tracking hot down her cheek. "I don't know if I deserve that," she whispered. "You do." Caleb reached over and brushed the tear away with his thumb, so gentle it made her breath catch. "And I'll keep telling you until you believe it." The shift came gradually. Mara started to notice things, small things. The way Caleb always made sure there was coffee waiting when she arrived. The way he listened when she talked, really listened, like every word mattered. The way he never once made her feel small for doubting or hesitating or being scared. And slowly, impossibly, she started to let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was real. One afternoon, she was helping him mend a fence on the far edge of his property when he said, out of nowhere, "You're different than you were a month ago." She looked up, startled. "Different how?" "Lighter." He hammered a nail into the post, then straightened. "Like you're not carrying as much." Mara thought about that. He wasn't wrong. The weight she'd been dragging around for years, the guilt, the grief, the conviction that she didn't matter, had started to ease. Not gone, but quieter. "Maybe I am," she said. Caleb smiled. Not his usual small, barely there smile. A real one. "Good," he said. "You should be." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of tools and the wind moving through the grass. Then Mara said, "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Why didn't you ever get married?" Caleb paused mid-swing, set the hammer down. "Because the woman I wanted didn't know I existed." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." Mara stepped closer, searching his face. "You really waited." "I really did." "That's insane." "Probably." He didn't sound bothered by the accusation, but I couldn't imagine it being anyone else. She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to hold the knowledge that someone had loved her, quietly, patiently, without expectation, for longer than most marriages lasted, so instead of saying anything, she kissed him. It wasn't planned, wasn't calculated, just a sudden, overwhelming need to close the space between them and prove to both of them that this was real. Caleb went still for half a second, surprised maybe, and then his hands came up to frame her face, careful and sure, and he kissed her back like he'd been waiting his whole life to do it. When they finally pulled apart, Mara was breathless. "I'm still scared," she said. "I know. I don't know if I'm good at this." "Neither do I." Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his hands still cradling her face. "But I'm willing to be bad at it with you if that's what it takes." Mara laughed, shaky, a little broken, but genuine. "That might be the least romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." "Good thing I'm not trying to be romantic, then." "What are you trying to be?" "Honest." And that, more than anything, was what made her believe him. Word got around fast. Cedar Hollow was small and people talked, and it didn't take long for the gossip to spread that Mara Ellison, the quiet, invisible woman no one had thought twice about, was spending time with Caleb Rowan. The reactions were mixed. Some people were curious, others skeptical. A few were outright confused, like they couldn't quite reconcile the idea that someone like Caleb would choose someone like her. Dorothy Carver cornered her outside the post office one morning, all false sweetness and barely concealed judgment. "I hear you've been keeping company with Mr. Rowan," she said, her tone dripping with implication. "I have," Mara said evenly. "Well, that's unexpected." "Why?" Dorothy blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "I just mean, well, you've always kept to yourself. And Caleb's so private. I didn't realize you two even knew each other." "We do now." "I see." Dorothy's smile tightened. "I hope you're being careful, dear. Men like that, they don't always mean what they say." Mara felt something shift inside her, something sharp and defensive. "I think," she said slowly, "you don't know Caleb Rowan half as well as you think you do." Dorothy's mouth opened, then closed. For once, she had nothing to say. Mara walked away before the conversation could go any further, but her hands were shaking by the time she reached her horse. She hated that it bothered her, hated that Dorothy's words had landed, even though she knew they were just petty gossip dressed up as concern. But they had landed. And that night, when she showed up at Caleb's ranch, he took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" "Nothing." "Mara," she sighed, told him about Dorothy, about the way people were starting to talk, starting to look at her differently, or maybe just starting to look at her at all. "Does it bother you?" Caleb asked when she finished. "It shouldn't." "That's not what I asked." "Yes," she admitted. "It bothers me. Because part of me still doesn't understand why you'd choose me. And when people act surprised, it just confirms it." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Come here." She crossed to where he was standing by the window, and he turned her to face him, hands steady on her shoulders. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I don't care what Dorothy Carver thinks. I don't care what anyone in that town thinks. The only opinion that matters is yours. And if you're with me because you want to be, not because you think you should be, not because you're trying to prove something, then that's all I need." "I do want to be here," Mara said, and she meant it. "But I'm still learning how to believe that's enough." "Then keep learning." Caleb's grip tightened just slightly. "I'll wait as long as it takes." And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Mara felt like maybe, just maybe, waiting wasn't the worst thing in the world. By the time summer turned toward fall, something had shifted between them. It wasn't loud or obvious, just a quiet deepening, like roots growing stronger beneath the surface. Mara found herself thinking about him at odd times, while kneading bread, while feeding the chickens, while lying in bed at night. Found herself missing him when they were apart, and feeling steadier when they were together. And Caleb, steady, patient Caleb, kept showing up, kept making space for her, kept proving, day after day, that he wasn't going anywhere. One evening, as they sat on his porch, watching the first stars appear, Mara said, "I think I'm falling in love with you." It came out quieter than she'd intended, almost like she wasn't sure she was allowed to say it. Caleb turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was so soft it nearly broke her. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, good." He reached over and took her hand, threading their fingers together. "Because I've been in love with you for 15 years, and it's about time you caught up." Mara laughed, real and unguarded, and leaned into him. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, known, chosen. And it was terrifying and beautiful and more than she'd ever thought she deserved. But sitting there beside Caleb Rowan, watching the night settle over the hills, Mara realized something that made her chest ache in the best possible way. Maybe she didn't have to deserve it. Maybe she just had to let herself have it. But letting herself have it turned out to be harder than Mara had anticipated. The words had come easy that night on the porch. "I think I'm falling in love with you." But living inside that truth was something else entirely. Because love, Mara was learning, wasn't just about the good moments. It was about all the broken parts you tried to hide, all the ways you'd learned to protect yourself, and whether you could trust someone else enough to see them. And Mara had spent too many years building walls to tear them down overnight. It started small. Little moments where she'd catch herself pulling back without meaning to. Like the morning Caleb showed up at her house unannounced, a bag of apples in hand and an easy smile on his face. "Thought you might want these," he said. "Got more than I need." Mara stared at the apples, then at him, and her first thought wasn't gratitude. It was suspicion. "Why?" she asked. Caleb's smile faltered. "Because I had extra. That's all." "You didn't have to do that." "I know. I don't need charity." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and the moment they left her mouth, she wanted to take them back. But it was too late. Caleb's expression shifted, not anger, but something close to hurt. "That's not what this is," he said quietly. "Then what is it?" "It's me thinking about you and wanting to do something nice. That's it. No strings, no ulterior motive." Mara's throat tightened. She knew she was being unfair. Knew she was twisting something simple into something complicated because accepting kindness felt dangerous. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I didn't mean—" "It's all right." But his voice was strained. "I'll leave these here. You don't have to take them if you don't want to." He set the bag on the porch and turned to leave, and Mara felt something crack inside her chest. "Caleb, wait." He stopped but didn't turn around. "I don't know how to do this," she said, and her voice broke. "I don't know how to let someone take care of me. I've been on my own so long, I'm not trying to take care of you." Caleb turned back, and the look on his face was raw. "I'm trying to love you, and I know that's not easy for you, but you can't keep punishing me for wanting to." The words hit like a slap, because he was right. She had been punishing him. Not intentionally, maybe, but the effect was the same. Every time he reached out, she flinched. Every time he offered something, she questioned it. And she was doing it because some part of her still believed she didn't deserve what he was giving. "I don't mean to," she whispered. "I know." Caleb stepped closer, his expression softening. "But Mara, you have to meet me halfway. I can't do this alone." She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. I'll try. That's all I'm asking. He left the apples. And Mara stood there on her porch long after he'd ridden away, staring at that simple bag of fruit and hating herself for making it complicated. The next time she saw him, she brought pie. It wasn't much, just a basic apple pie made from the fruit he'd given her. But it felt like an apology she didn't know how to say with words. Caleb opened the door, saw the pie in her hands, and smiled. You didn't have to do this, he said. I know. Mara met his eyes. But I wanted to. Something passed between them. Understanding maybe, or just the acknowledgement that they were both trying. Come in, Caleb said, stepping aside. I'll make coffee. They sat at his table, same as always, and ate pie in comfortable silence. And when Mara finally worked up the nerve to speak, she said, I'm scared. Caleb looked up. Of what? Of messing this up, of being too broken to give you what you need. You're not broken. You don't know that. I know you. Caleb set down his fork and leaned forward. And yeah, you're scared. You've got walls. You don't trust easy. But that doesn't make you broken, Mara. That makes you human. What if I can't get past it? Then we'll figure it out. His voice was steady, certain. But you have to stop assuming I'm going to leave the second things get hard. I'm not going anywhere. Mara wanted to believe him, wanted to take that promise and hold it tight and let it be enough. But the fear was still there, coiled in her chest like something alive. I need time, she said quietly. You've got it. How much? As much as you need. It was such a simple answer, so patient, and it made Mara's heart ache in ways she didn't know how to name. Thank you, she whispered. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. You don't have to thank me for loving you, Mara. That's not something you earn. It's just something I do. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of progress and setback. Some days Mara felt like she was getting better at this, at letting Caleb in, at believing she deserved what he was offering. Other days the old instincts kicked in, and she'd retreat without meaning to, pulling back into the safety of distance. Caleb never pushed, never demanded, just stayed steady, like a fixed point she could always find her way back to. But the town was getting harder to ignore. The gossip had started small, whispers and sideways glances, but it had grown. And the more time Mara spent with Caleb, the more people seemed to have opinions about it. Some were genuinely curious, asking questions that felt intrusive but not outright cruel. Others were less kind. Dorothy Carver had made it her personal mission to remind Mara at every opportunity that men like Caleb Rowan didn't settle down with women like her, that she should be careful, that she shouldn't get her hopes up. Mara tried not to let it bother her, tried to focus on what mattered, on Caleb, on the quiet life they were building together. But the doubt crept in anyway. One afternoon she was at the mercantile when she overheard two women talking near the fabric bolts. She didn't catch their names, but she caught enough of the conversation to know they were talking about her. I don't understand it, one of them said. She's so plain. What does he see in her? Maybe he feels sorry for her, the other replied. You know, after her mother and all. Maybe he's just being kind. Kind is one thing, but courting, that's something else. Well, it won't last. Men like Caleb Rowan don't end up with women like Mara Ellison. He'll realize it eventually. Mara's hands clenched around the spool of thread she'd been holding. She wanted to turn around and confront them, wanted to defend herself, defend Caleb, defend what they had. But she didn't, because part of her, some small poisonous part, wondered if they were right. That night, she didn't go to Caleb's ranch. She stayed home instead, pacing her small house and trying to convince herself that what those women had said didn't matter, that their opinions didn't define her, that she was stronger than this. But the thoughts wouldn't stop. What does he see in her? It won't last. He'll realize it eventually. She was still pacing when someone knocked on her door. Mara froze. She knew who it was before she opened it. Caleb stood on her porch, hat in hand, his expression unreadable. You didn't come tonight, he said. I know. You all right? I'm fine. Mara. His voice was gentle but firm. Don't lie to me. She looked away, unable to hold his gaze. I just needed space. From me? from everything. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I come in?" Mara hesitated, then stepped aside. He walked past her into the small sitting room, and she closed the door, her heart pounding. "What happened?" Caleb asked, turning to face her. "Nothing." "That's the second time you've lied to me in under a minute. Want to try again?" Mara's defenses flared. "I said I'm fine. And I don't believe you." "Then maybe you should leave." The words came out harsher than she'd meant, and Caleb flinched, but he didn't move. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. "Not until you tell me what's going on." "Why does it matter?" "Because you matter." His voice rose slightly, frustration bleeding through. "Because I care about you, and I can see you're hurting, and I'm not going to walk away just because you're trying to push me out." "Maybe you should." Mara's voice cracked. "Maybe everyone's right. Maybe this doesn't make sense. Maybe you'd be better off with someone who isn't so—" "Don't!" Caleb crossed the room in 2 strides and gripped her shoulders, not hard, but firm enough to make her look at him. "Don't you dare finish that sentence." "Why not? It's true." "It's not." "You don't know that." "I know you." His eyes burned into hers. "And I know this town. And I know whatever somebody said to you today. It got in your head and made you doubt everything. So tell me what they said." Mara's throat tightened. She didn't want to repeat it, didn't want to give those words more power than they already had. But Caleb was staring at her with so much intensity, so much unwavering certainty, that she couldn't keep it in. "They said you'd realize eventually," she whispered, "that you'd figure out I'm not worth it. That men like you don't end up with women like me." Caleb's jaw clenched. "Who said that?" "It doesn't matter." "It does to me." "Caleb, who?" "I don't know their names." The frustration burst out of her. "I don't know, all right? Just 2 women at the Mercantile who think they know you better than I do, who think they know what you want." "They don't." "How do you know?" "Because I'm standing here." Caleb's grip on her shoulders tightened. "Because I've been standing here for months trying to show you that you're what I want, that you've always been what I want. And I'm not going to stop just because some gossips can't wrap their heads around it." "But what if they're right?" Mara's voice broke. "What if you do realize it? What if you wake up one day and see me the way they see me? Plain, forgettable, not enough." "Then I'm a fool." Caleb's voice was rough. "But I'm not going to wake up and stop loving you, Mara. That's not how this works." "You don't know that." "I do." He pulled her closer, and his voice dropped to something fierce and tender all at once. "I've loved you for 15 years, through silence, through distance, through watching you grieve and struggle and disappear into yourself. And not once did I stop. So don't tell me I don't know. Don't tell me this isn't real just because you're scared." Mara's vision blurred. "I don't know how to stop being scared." "Then be scared." Caleb's hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. "Be scared and stay anyway. That's all I'm asking." "What if I can't?" "You can." His forehead pressed against hers. "You're stronger than you think, Mara. You've survived things that would have broken most people. You can survive this too." "This is different." "I know. I don't want to lose you." "You won't." "You can't promise that." "I can." Caleb's voice was steady, unshakable. "Because I'm choosing you every day, and I'm going to keep choosing you no matter what anyone says. So the only question is whether you're going to choose me back." Mara's breath hitched. Because that was the question, wasn't it? The one she'd been avoiding for weeks. Not whether Caleb loved her, not whether he was real or trustworthy or worth the risk, but whether she was brave enough to love him back. And standing there in her small, dimly lit sitting room, with Caleb Rowan holding her like she was something precious, Mara realized something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She wanted to be brave. "I choose you," she whispered. Caleb went still. "Say that again." "I choose you." Louder this time, more certain. "I'm terrified, and I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm probably going to mess this up 100 times, but I choose you." The smile that broke across Caleb's face was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "That's all I need," he said, and then he kissed her. It wasn't like the first time, tentative and testing. This was something deeper, more desperate, like they were both trying to prove something to each other and to themselves. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers again. "You're not going to mess this up," he said quietly. "You don't know that. I don't care if you do." He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "We'll figure it out. Together." And for the first time since this whole thing started, Mara believed him. Oh. The shift after that night was subtle but undeniable. Mara stopped pulling away, stopped questioning every kind gesture or soft word, started letting herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to have this. And Caleb, steady as ever, met her halfway. They fell into a rhythm that felt less like courtship and more like partnership. Mara would help him with work around the ranch, mending fences, feeding livestock, anything that needed doing. Caleb would show up at her place with firewood or supplies, never making a big deal out of it, just doing what needed to be done. They talked more, laughed more, and slowly, the fear that had been choking Mara for so long started to loosen its grip. One evening, as they sat on his porch watching the sunset, Caleb said, "I want to marry you." It wasn't a question, just a statement, simple and direct. Mara's heart stuttered. "What?" "I want to marry you," he repeated, turning to look at her. "Not right now, if you're not ready, but eventually. I want you to be my wife." She stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. "You're serious?" "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't." "Caleb, we've only been 15 years, Mara." His voice was calm, certain. "I've known for 15 years. I don't need more time to be sure." "But I might." "That's fine." He reached over and took her hand. "Like I said, not right now. But I wanted you to know. I wanted you to know where this is heading, for me, at least." Mara's throat tightened, because the truth was, she wanted it too, wanted the life he was offering, the partnership, the permanence, the promise that she wouldn't have to face the world alone anymore. But wanting it and believing she deserved it were still two different things. "I need time," she said quietly. "You've got it." "How much?" Caleb smiled. "As much as you need. I'm not going anywhere." And Mara knew he meant it. What? But time, it turned out, had its own plans. 2 weeks later, Mara was in town picking up supplies when she ran into Dorothy Carver again. This time, Dorothy wasn't alone. She was with 3 other women, all of them watching Mara with expressions that ranged from pity to barely concealed disdain. "Mara," Dorothy said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "How lovely to see you." "Dorothy," Mara kept her tone neutral. "We were just talking about the harvest dance next month. You're planning to attend, I assume." Mara hesitated. She hadn't thought about it. Social events weren't really her thing. "I'm not sure," she said. "Oh, you should." Dorothy's smile sharpened. "I'm sure Mr. Rowan would love to escort you, unless, of course, things have changed between you two." The implication was clear, and the other women were watching, waiting to see how Mara would respond. For a moment, the old instinct kicked in, the urge to shrink, to deflect, to disappear. But then she thought about Caleb, about the way he'd looked at her when she said, "I choose you," about the way he'd never once made her feel small or unworthy or less than. And something inside her snapped. "Things haven't changed," Mara said, her voice steady. "If anything, they've gotten stronger." Dorothy blinked, clearly not expecting that. "Oh, well, that's good." "It is." Mara met her gaze head on. "And for the record, Dorothy, Caleb Rowan doesn't need your approval. Neither do I." She didn't wait for a response, just turned and walked away, her heart pounding but her head held high. And when she told Caleb about it later that night, he laughed, deep and genuine, and pulled her into his arms. "That's my girl," he said. And Mara realized with a fierce sort of joy that she was starting to believe it too. The harvest dance came faster than Mara expected. She'd agreed to go, not because she particularly wanted to, but because Caleb had asked, and she was done hiding. The night of the dance, she wore her best dress, a simple green thing that had been her mother's, and let her hair down. When Caleb arrived to pick her up, the look on his face made her chest ache. "You're beautiful," he said. "You don't have to say that." "I'm not saying it because I have to." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I'm saying it because it's true." At the dance, people stared. Of course they did. Mara Ellison and Caleb Rowan, walking in together, his hand resting at the small of her back like she belonged there. Some of the looks were curious, others judgmental, a few openly hostile. But Mara didn't care, because when Caleb led her onto the dance floor and pulled her close, the rest of the world fell away. "You all right?" he murmured. "Yeah." And she meant it. "I'm all right." They danced until her feet hurt, and when it was over, Caleb walked her home under a sky full of stars. At her door, he kissed her goodnight, slow and sweet, and said, "I'm proud of you." "For what?" "For showing up, for not letting them make you feel small." Mara smiled. "I had help." "You did it yourself." Caleb brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I just stood next to you." And as she watched him ride away, Mara realized something that made her heart swell. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen, known, loved, and she was done being afraid of it. The morning after the dance, Mara woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't that her doubts had vanished entirely. They were still there, lurking in the corners of her mind like shadows that refused to disappear. But they were quieter now, manageable. And for the first time, she felt like she had something stronger to hold on to than fear. She had Caleb. And more importantly, she had herself. The realization settled over her like sunlight breaking through clouds, warm and undeniable. She wasn't the same woman who'd opened her door months ago to find him standing there with an impossible confession. She'd changed, grown, become someone who could stand in a room full of judgment and not crumble. And it felt good. She was making coffee when someone knocked on her door, sharp, insistent, nothing like Caleb's steady rhythm. Mara set down the pot and crossed to the entry, pulling the door open to find a man she didn't recognize standing on her porch. He was older, maybe 50, with a hard face and eyes that assessed her like she was livestock being appraised. His clothes were expensive, too expensive for Cedar Hollow, and he carried himself with the kind of arrogance that came from never being told no. "Miss Ellison?" he said. "That's right." "Name's Vernon Hayes. I'm here on business." Mara's stomach tightened. She didn't know anyone named Vernon Hayes, and she couldn't imagine what business he'd have with her. "What kind of business?" "The kind that involves your property." Hayes gestured vaguely toward the land around her house. "I represent a group of investors interested in purchasing parcels in this area. We're prepared to make you a fair offer." "I'm not selling." "You haven't heard the offer yet." "Don't need to." Mara kept her voice level. "This land belonged to my mother. It's not for sale." Hayes smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Everything's for sale, Miss Ellison. It's just a matter of price." "Not this." "I'd encourage you to reconsider." His tone shifted, took on an edge. "The territory's changing. Development's coming whether people like it or not. Those who cooperate early tend to fare better than those who resist." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice." Hayes pulled a card from his pocket and held it out. "Think it over. When you're ready to discuss terms, you know where to find me." Mara didn't take the card. After a moment, Hayes set it on the porch rail and tipped his hat. "Good day, Miss Ellison." He left, climbing into a carriage that had been waiting at the road, and Mara stood there watching until he disappeared from view. Then she picked up the card, walked back inside, and threw it in the stove. She told Caleb about it that afternoon. He'd been working on repairs to his barn, sleeves rolled up and sweat on his brow, and when she rode up, he set down his tools immediately. "You all right?" he asked, reading something in her expression. "I'm fine. Just need to tell you something." They sat on the porch steps, and Mara recounted the conversation with Hayes, every word, every implication. Caleb listened without interrupting, but his jaw tightened progressively as she spoke. "You know him?" Mara asked when she finished. "I know of him." Caleb's voice was hard. "Vernon Hayes works for the Territorial Land Consortium. They've been buying up property all over this region, sometimes legally, sometimes not." "What do you mean, not legally?" "I mean they pressure people. Make offers that sound generous until you realize they're half what the land's actually worth. And if you refuse, things start happening. Accidents, fires, livestock going missing. Just enough to make life difficult." Mara's blood ran cold. "They can't do that." "They can if no one stops them." Caleb looked at her, his expression grim. "And most people don't. They take the money and leave because fighting back costs more than it's worth." "I'm not selling." "I know, but you need to be careful." "Careful how?" Just, Caleb rubbed a hand over his face. Keep your doors locked. Don't go anywhere alone after dark. And if Hayes or anyone like him shows up again, don't engage. Just send them away and come find me. You think they'd actually hurt me? I think they do whatever it takes to get what they want. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. And I'm not taking chances with you. Mara reached over and took his hand. I can handle myself. I know you can, but you don't have to handle it alone. She squeezed his fingers. I know. For a few weeks, nothing happened. Mara went about her routines, tending her chickens, working her small garden, making trips into town for supplies. Caleb came by more often than usual, always with some excuse about needing to check on something or having extra time, but they both knew why he was really there. He was worried. And honestly, so was Mara. Because even though Hayes hadn't returned, the awareness of his presence, of the consortium's presence, hung over everything like a storm cloud waiting to break. Then one morning, Mara woke to find her chicken coop torn apart. The door hung off its hinges. Feathers littered the ground. 3 of her hens were dead, their bodies strewn across the yard like discarded rags, and the rest were gone. Scattered or stolen, she couldn't tell which. Mara stood in the middle of the wreckage, her hands shaking. This wasn't an animal attack. Animals didn't unhinge doors, didn't leave corpses arranged in a way that felt deliberate. This was a message. She was still standing there when Caleb arrived. He must have seen the damage from the road because he didn't bother tying his horse, just crossed the yard in long strides and pulled her into his arms without a word. I'm all right, Mara said, though her voice was unsteady. No, you're not. It's just chickens. It's not just chickens. Caleb pulled back enough to look at her, his eyes blazing. This is them telling you what they're willing to do. Then they're wasting their time. I'm still not selling. Mara, I'm not. She pulled away, anger replacing the shock. This is my home, Caleb. It's all I have left of my mother, and I'm not letting some bullies with money take it from me. I'm not asking you to sell. His voice gentled. I'm asking you to let me help. How? By not being alone here anymore. Caleb hesitated, then said, Move in with me. Mara blinked. What? Move in with me, at the ranch. You'll be safer there, and I won't spend every night wondering if something's happened to you. Caleb, I can't just... Why not? Because... She fumbled for a reason that didn't sound ridiculous. Because we're not married. People will talk. Let them. It's not that simple. It is if you want it to be. Caleb stepped closer, his expression intense. I don't care what this town thinks. I care about you being safe. And right now, you're not safe here. I can't just abandon my house. You're not abandoning it. You're protecting yourself. He reached up and cupped her face. Please, Mara, let me do this. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle this on her own, that she didn't need protecting, that giving in would mean Hayes had won. But the truth was, she was scared, and she was tired of pretending she wasn't. Okay, she whispered. Relief flooded Caleb's face. Yeah? Yeah, but just until this is over. However long you need. Hot. Moving turned out to be easier than Mara expected. She didn't have much, clothes, a few personal items, her mother's quilt. Caleb helped her load everything onto a wagon, and within an afternoon her life had been transplanted to his ranch. It felt strange at first. The house was bigger than hers, more lived in, with Caleb's presence in every corner, but it also felt safe in a way her own home hadn't in weeks. That first night, Caleb set her up in the spare room. You don't have to, Mara started. I know. He cut her off gently. But I'm not assuming anything. You're here because you need to be, not because of anything else. Caleb, just let me do this right, okay? She nodded, throat tight. But later that night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Mara found she couldn't sleep. Not because she was uncomfortable, but because she kept thinking about Caleb in the next room, about the space between them, about how badly she wanted to close it. She lasted maybe an hour before she gave up. When she knocked on his door, Caleb answered immediately, like he hadn't been sleeping either. You all right? He asked. Can I... Mara hesitated. Can I stay in here? With you? Caleb's expression softened. You don't have to ask. He stepped aside and Mara slipped past him into the room. It was simple, sparse, Just a bed and a dresser and a window that looked out over the dark hills. Caleb closed the door and stood there, uncertain for maybe the first time since she'd known him. "I'm not," he started. I don't expect—" "I know." Mara crossed to the bed and sat down. "I just don't want to be alone tonight." "Okay." He climbed in beside her, keeping a careful distance, and they lay there in the darkness without touching. After a while, Mara said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For not making this complicated." "It's not complicated." Caleb's voice was quiet. "You needed something, and I gave it to you. That's it." But it wasn't just that, and they both knew it. Mara rolled onto her side, facing him, and said, "I want to marry you." Caleb went still. "What?" "I want to marry you," she repeated, stronger this time. "I know I said I needed time, and maybe I still do. But I also know I don't want to keep waiting for the perfect moment, or the right feeling, or whatever I thought I was supposed to have. I just want you. So if the offer is still open, it's open." Caleb's voice was rough. "It's always been open." "Then ask me again." He shifted, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look at her properly. In the dim light, his expression was almost unbearably tender. "Mara Ellison," he said quietly, "will you marry me?" "Yes." The word came out steady and sure, and Caleb's answering smile was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promise, and Mara felt something inside her finally fully settle into place. They got married 3 days later. There was no ceremony, no guests, no announcement in town, just the two of them and a circuit judge who happened to be passing through, standing in Caleb's front room while the afternoon light slanted through the windows. "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "And do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Mara looked at Caleb, at this man who'd loved her in silence for 15 years, who'd waited and fought and refused to give up on her even when she'd been ready to give up on herself, and felt her heart swell so large it hurt. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." Caleb kissed her before the judge had even finished speaking, and Mara laughed against his mouth, dizzy with joy and disbelief, and the sheer impossibility of how her life had changed. When they finally pulled apart, the judge was smiling. "Congratulations," he said, handing Caleb the marriage certificate. "You two take care of each other." "We will," Caleb said, and his hand tightened around Mara's. After the judge left, they stood in the quiet of the house, just the two of them, and Mara felt the weight of what they'd just done settle over her. "We're married," she said, like she needed to hear it out loud to believe it. "We're married," Caleb confirmed. "I don't feel any different." "Give it time." But he was wrong, because Mara did feel different, not in some grand, transformative way, but in 100 small ones. In the way Caleb was looking at her, in the way her hand felt in his, in the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore, not just for tonight, but for every night after this. "What now?" she asked. Caleb pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her like a shield. "Now we live." The news reached town within a week. Mara wasn't sure how. Maybe the judge had mentioned it, or maybe someone had seen them together and put the pieces together. But either way, Cedar Hollow found out, and the reactions were exactly what she'd expected. Shock, disbelief, a fair amount of outrage from people who thought they had a right to an opinion on other people's lives. Dorothy Carver was beside herself. "You married him?" she said when she cornered Mara outside the post office. "Without telling anyone? Without even a proper ceremony?" "Didn't see the need," Mara said calmly. But that's not how it's done. People will talk. Let them." "Mara, I'm just trying to help you understand." "I understand fine, Dorothy." Mara met her gaze squarely. "I understand that you think you have some say in my life. But you don't. So unless you've got something useful to contribute, I'd appreciate it if you'd step aside." Dorothy's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Then she turned on her heel and stalked off, muttering under her breath. Mara watched her go, feeling lighter than she had in years. But not everyone in town was hostile. A few people Mara had barely spoken to before, offered quiet congratulations. A nod here, a smile there, a murmured "good for you" that felt genuine. It wasn't much, but it was something. And it reminded Mara that Cedar Hollow wasn't just a place of judgment and gossip. It was also home to people who understood what it meant to fight for what you wanted, to carve out a life in a place that didn't always make it easy. One afternoon, as Mara was leaving the mercantile, an older woman stopped her. "Mrs. Rowan," the woman said, and Mara startled at the name. "Yes?" "I just wanted to say congratulations. Caleb's a good man. You're lucky to have him." "I am," Mara agreed. The woman smiled. "And he's lucky to have you. Don't let anyone tell you different." She walked away before Mara could respond, but the words stayed with her long after. Meanwhile, the situation with Vernon Hayes and the consortium was escalating. 2 more properties in the area had been targeted. Fires mostly, though one family had their well poisoned. The attacks were brazen, deliberate, designed to send a message. Sell or suffer the consequences. Caleb started organizing the other ranchers, calling meetings to discuss how to protect their land and their families. Mara attended every one, standing beside him as he laid out plans for watches, patrols, coordinated resistance. "They want us divided," Caleb said at one meeting, addressing a room full of worried faces. "They want us scared and isolated, so we're easier to pick off. But if we stand together, they can't touch us." "And if they try?" someone asked. "Then we make it cost them more than it's worth." It was a risk. Everyone knew it. But the alternative, giving in, letting Hayes and his people take what they wanted, felt worse. So they agreed. And for the first time in weeks, Mara felt like they had a fighting chance. But the confrontation came on a cold morning in late October. Mara and Caleb were at the ranch when one of the neighbors rode up, his face pale. "They're at the Hendersons' place," he said, breathless. "Hayes and a group of men. They're trying to force them out." Caleb didn't hesitate. "Round up everyone you can. We're going." Within 20 minutes, a group of 10 ranchers and their families had assembled. They rode hard toward the Henderson property, and when they arrived, they found exactly what the neighbor had described. Vernon Hayes stood in the yard with 6 hired men, all of them armed. The Hendersons, an older couple who'd lived on that land for 30 years, were backed up against their house, fear written across their faces. "This doesn't concern you, Rowan," Hayes said when he saw Caleb dismount. "It does when you're threatening my neighbors." "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm conducting business." "Business doesn't involve guns." Hayes smiled. "Out here, it does." The tension in the yard was thick enough to cut. Mara stayed on her horse, her heart pounding, but she kept her expression steady. "The Hendersons aren't selling," Caleb said. "None of us are. So you can take your men and leave, or we can have a different kind of conversation." "You think you can stop me?" Hayes's voice was mocking. "You and what? 10 farmers with more guts than sense?" "Try us and find out." For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of Hayes's men shifted, his hand drifting toward his gun, and everything exploded. Caleb moved faster than Mara had ever seen him move, closing the distance and slamming his fist into the man's jaw before the gun even cleared leather. The man went down hard, and chaos erupted. The other ranchers surged forward, and Hayes's men, outnumbered and clearly not expecting real resistance, scrambled to defend themselves. It wasn't a gunfight, thank heavens, just fists and shouting and bodies colliding in the dust. Mara dismounted and ran to Mrs. Henderson, pulling the older woman away from the fight. "You all right?" Mara asked. I think so." "Get inside, lock the doors." Mrs. Henderson nodded and disappeared into the house, her husband following close behind. When Mara turned back, the fight was already over. Hayes's men were on the ground, bloodied and beaten, and Hayes himself stood frozen, staring at Caleb with an expression that was half rage, half disbelief. "You're making a mistake," Hayes said. "No." Caleb's voice was cold. "You are. This land isn't yours to take. And if you or your people come back here again, we won't be so gentle. You can't fight the consortium forever. Watch us." Hayes stared at him for another moment, then gestured to his men. They climbed to their feet, bruised and humiliated, and retreated to their horses. "This isn't over," Hayes said. "Yeah," Caleb replied. "It is." Hayes and his men rode off, leaving nothing but dust and silence behind. The ranchers stood in a loose circle, breathing hard, and then someone laughed, nervous, relieved, and the tension broke. "We did it," one of them said. "For now," Caleb cautioned. But we need to stay ready. They might come back. Then we'll be here, another rancher said, together. And looking around at the faces of her neighbors, people who'd stood up, who'd refused to be intimidated, Mara felt something powerful swell in her chest. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting back. That night, back at the ranch, Mara and Caleb sat on the porch in silence. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving exhaustion in its wake, but there was also a quiet satisfaction. They'd won. Not the war, maybe, but the battle. "You were incredible today," Caleb said finally. "I didn't do anything." "You got Mrs. Henderson to safety. That's something." Mara leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Do you think Hayes will come back?" "Maybe, but not for a while. And when he does, we'll be ready." "You really think we can win this?" "I think we already did." Caleb's arm came around her shoulders. "They wanted us scared and divided, but we stood together. That's the win." Mara thought about that, about the way the community had rallied, the way people had put aside their differences to protect what mattered. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "I'm proud of us." They sat there until the stars came out, and for the first time in a long time, Mara felt like the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to build. And build they did. The months following the confrontation with Hayes brought a kind of peace Mara hadn't known was possible. Not the absence of struggle, there was still plenty of that, but the kind of peace that came from knowing you weren't facing it alone. The Territorial Land Consortium pulled back, though whether it was because they'd lost their nerve or were simply regrouping, no one could say for certain. Either way, the attacks stopped, the threats quieted, and life in Cedar Hollow settled into something that resembled normal. Mara threw herself into the work of the ranch with a ferocity that surprised even her. She'd spent so many years just surviving, just getting through each day, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to build something, to have a purpose beyond endurance. Caleb worked beside her, steady as always, and together they turned his ranch into theirs. They mended fences and expanded the herd. They planted a larger garden than either of them needed, just because they could. They fixed up the spare room, the one Mara had slept in for exactly one night, and turned it into something useful. And through it all, Mara learned what it meant to be a wife. Not in the way she'd imagined back when she was young and still believed in fairy tales. This wasn't some grand romance where everything fell into place and life became easy. It was messier than that, harder, more real. There were mornings when she woke up irritable and snapped at Caleb over nothing. Evenings when he came home exhausted, and they ate dinner in silence because neither of them had the energy for conversation. Nights when old fears crept back in and she lay awake wondering if she was doing any of this right. But there were also moments of startling tenderness, like the time Caleb brought her wildflowers for no reason other than he'd seen them and thought of her. Or the night she fell asleep on the porch and woke to find him carrying her to bed, his touch so gentle it made her chest ache. Or the 100 small ways he showed her every day that she mattered, the coffee he made without being asked, the way he listened when she talked, the quiet certainty in his voice when he told her he loved her. Marriage, Mara discovered, wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, about choosing each other over and over, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. And slowly, she started to believe she was good at it. Spring came early that year, bringing with it news that changed everything. Mara had been feeling off for weeks, tired in a way that sleep didn't fix, queasy in the mornings, emotional in ways that didn't make sense. She'd chalked it up to the change in seasons, to the lingering stress from the consortium trouble, to anything but the truth, until the day she couldn't ignore it anymore. She was in the garden, pulling weeds, when a wave of nausea hit so hard she barely made it to the fence before she was sick. Caleb found her there a few minutes later, pale and shaking. "Mara?" He was beside her in an instant, hand on her back. "What's wrong?" "I don't know, I just—" Another wave hit and she doubled over. "We're going to town. Now!" "Caleb, I'm fine." "You're not fine." He helped her to the wagon, and they made the trip to Cedar Hollow in tense silence. The town had a doctor now, a young man named Porter who'd set up practice 6 months prior, and Caleb all but carried Mara into his office. Dr. Porter examined her with a professionalism that would have been reassuring if Mara hadn't been so terrified. When he finally stepped back, there was a small smile on his face. "Congratulations, Mrs. Rowan," he said. You're going to have a baby." The world tilted. Mara stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "You're pregnant, about 3 months along, I'd estimate." That's not possible." "I assure you it is." Mara looked at Caleb, who'd gone completely still. His expression was unreadable, and for a moment she couldn't tell if he was happy or horrified. Then he smiled, slow and wide and so full of joy it took her breath away. "We're having a baby," he said, like he needed to hear it out loud to believe it. "We're having a baby," Mara echoed, and then she started crying. Not sad tears, not scared tears, just overwhelming, all-consuming emotion that she didn't have words for. Caleb pulled her into his arms, and they stood there in Dr. Porter's office, holding each other while the reality of it sank in. The news spread through Cedar Hollow faster than wildfire. Mara hadn't intended to tell anyone, not yet, not until she'd had time to process it herself. But Dorothy Carver had been in the waiting room when they left Dr. Porter's office, and within hours the whole town knew. The reactions were mixed, as always. Some people were genuinely happy for them. Others seemed almost offended, like Mara getting pregnant was a personal affront to their sensibilities. A few made pointed comments about the timing, implying things that made Mara's blood boil. But she didn't care, because for the first time in her life, she had something that was entirely hers. Hers and Caleb's. Something that no amount of gossip or judgment could take away. At home, Caleb was a mess of excitement and anxiety. "We need to expand the house," he said one evening, pacing the front room like a caged animal. "The baby's going to need a room, and we should get a cradle. Do you know how to make a cradle? I could probably figure it out. Or maybe we should buy one. Do they sell cradles in Cedar Hollow?" "Caleb," Mara caught his hand, pulling him to a stop. "Breathe." "I'm breathing." "You're panicking." "I'm not." He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. "Okay, maybe a little." "Why?" "Because I don't know how to be a father." The admission came out rough, almost desperate. "I don't know the first thing about babies. What if I mess it up? What if I'm not—" "You'll be fine," Mara interrupted gently. "You don't know that." "I do." She placed his hand on her stomach, even though there was nothing to feel yet. "Because you're already trying. You're already worrying about getting it right. That's more than a lot of fathers do." Caleb looked down at where his hand rested, and something in his expression softened. "I want to be good at this." "You will be." "How do you know?" "Because you're good at everything that matters." He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head, and they stood there in the quiet of their home, feeling the weight and wonder of what was coming. Pregnancy was not kind to Mara. The nausea persisted well into her 4th month, and exhaustion hit her like a freight train. There were days when just getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain, and she hated it, hated feeling weak, hated needing help, hated the way her body seemed to have its own agenda that she had no control over. Caleb was patient in ways that made her want to scream and cry at the same time. He took over most of the heavy work without being asked, made sure she ate even when she didn't want to, sat with her on the bad days and didn't try to fix anything, just existed beside her until the nausea or the tears or the overwhelming fear passed. "I'm sorry," Mara said one night, after a particularly rough day. I know this isn't easy." "You're growing a whole person," Caleb said, his tone matter of fact. "I think you get a pass on being difficult." "I'm more than difficult. I'm a nightmare." "You're my nightmare," he kissed her forehead, "and I wouldn't trade you for anything." It was such a simple statement, but it undid her completely, because that was what Caleb did. He took the hard things, the messy, complicated, imperfect things, and loved them anyway. Loved her anyway. By her 6th month, Mara's body had changed in ways that felt both miraculous and alien. Her stomach had rounded out, undeniable now, and she could feel the baby moving. Little flutters at first, then stronger kicks that made her gasp. It was surreal, feeling another life inside her, knowing that in a few months she'd be responsible for another human being. The fear was constant, not overwhelming, but always there, lurking in the background. What if she wasn't a good mother? What if she didn't know how to love this child the way it deserved? What if she repeated the mistakes her own mother had made? The distance, the emotional unavailability, the way she'd made Mara feel like a burden. She voiced these fears to Caleb one night, and he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You're not your mother." "How do you know?" Because you're already worrying about being a good parent. Your mother never did that. Mara blinked. She didn't? From what you've told me? No. She did what she thought she was supposed to do, but she never questioned it, never worried if it was enough. You're already doing better than that. It was such a small reassurance, but it lodged itself in Mara's chest and stayed there. The baby came on a cold night in December. Mara had been feeling odd all day, restless, uncomfortable, like her body was preparing for something it hadn't told her brain about yet. Caleb had noticed, hovering close, and when the first contraction hit, he went pale. Is it time? I think so. I'll get the doctor. Caleb, we have time. But he was already out the door, riding hard toward town. Mara would have laughed if another contraction hadn't stolen her breath. By the time Caleb returned with Dr. Porter, the contractions were coming faster, harder, and Mara was starting to understand why women talked about childbirth the way they did. It wasn't just pain, it was everything. Every fear, every doubt, every ounce of strength she had, all compressed into hours that felt like days. Caleb stayed beside her the entire time, holding her hand, murmuring encouragement, looking almost as wrecked as she felt. I can't do this, Mara gasped at one point, tears streaming down her face. You can, Caleb said, his voice steady. You're the strongest person I know. I'm not. You are. He pressed his forehead to hers. And you're almost there. Just a little more. She didn't believe him, but she kept going anyway. And then, after what felt like an eternity, there was a cry. High and piercing and absolutely perfect. Dr. Porter worked quickly, and then he was placing a tiny, squirming bundle in Mara's arms. It's a girl, he said, smiling. Mara looked down at the baby, at her daughter, and the world stopped. She was so small, so impossibly fragile. Her face was red and scrunched, her tiny fists waving, and she was the most beautiful thing Mara had ever seen. Hi, Mara whispered, her voice breaking. Hi, sweetheart. Caleb leaned over, his hand coming to rest on the baby's head, and when Mara looked up at him, there were tears on his face. She's perfect, he said. She is. And in that moment, Mara understood something she'd spent her whole life searching for. This. This was what she'd been waiting for. Not just love, not just family, but the chance to build something good, something lasting, something that would outlive her and carry on long after she was gone. They named her Rose, not after anyone in particular, just because it felt right. Because roses were tough, resilient, able to grow in harsh conditions. And Mara wanted her daughter to be all of those things. The first few months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings and learning how to be parents through sheer trial and error. Rose was a fussy baby, prone to colic and inexplicable crying jags that left both Mara and Caleb frayed and exhausted. But there were also moments of piercing joy. The first time Rose smiled, a real smile, not just gas, Mara cried. The first time she laughed, Caleb looked so proud you'd think she'd won a medal. And the way she'd settle when Mara held her, her tiny body relaxing into trust, made every hard moment worth it. She looks like you, Caleb said one evening, watching Rose sleep. She looks like a potato, Mara replied. A beautiful potato. Mara laughed, and Rose stirred but didn't wake. You're ridiculous. Maybe, but I'm not wrong. And looking at their daughter, at the life they'd created together, Mara had to admit he had a point. Cham. Rose was 2 when Mara realized she was pregnant again. This time, the news didn't come as a shock. She recognized the signs, knew what her body was telling her, and when she told Caleb, he just grinned and pulled her into his arms. Guess we're doing this again, he said. Guess so. Their son arrived the following spring, a big, healthy baby with Caleb's dark hair and a set of lungs that could wake the dead. They named him James, and he was everything Rose wasn't, easy, placid, content to sleep and eat and observe the world with calm curiosity. This one's yours, Mara told Caleb after a particularly peaceful night. What do you mean? Rose got my temperament. James got yours. Caleb looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms and smiled. Poor kid, but there was pride in his voice. And love. So much love, it made Mara's heart ache. Yeah. The years blurred together after that. Not in a bad way, just in the way time moves when you're busy living it. Rose grew into a fierce, stubborn little girl who climbed trees and chased chickens and asked 1,000 questions a day. James followed behind her like a shadow, quieter but no less determined, content to let his sister lead while he observed and learned. Mara watched them grow with a mixture of awe and terror. Because raising children, she discovered, was nothing like she'd imagined. It was harder, messier, more exhausting and more rewarding than anything she'd ever done. There were days when she felt like she was failing, when Rose threw a tantrum in the middle of town and Mara wanted to disappear. When James got sick and she spent 3 sleepless nights convinced she was going to lose him. When the weight of responsibility felt so heavy she didn't know how she'd carry it another day. But there were also days when everything clicked. When Rose ran to her with a handful of wildflowers, her face lit up with joy. When James said "Mama" for the first time, his voice soft and sure. When she and Caleb sat on the porch after the kids were asleep, bone-tired but content, and she realized this, all of this, was exactly what she'd been searching for her whole life. By the time Rose was 10 and James was 8, the ranch had become something bigger than Mara and Caleb had ever planned. They'd expanded the herd, built a second barn, hired seasonal hands to help with the heavy work. The land that had once been just Caleb's had become theirs, truly theirs, marked by years of sweat and struggle and stubborn refusal to give up. The Territorial Land Consortium had never returned. Hayes had disappeared. Rumor had it to another territory where the pickings were easier, and the ranchers who'd stood together that day at the Hendersons' place had formed a bond that lasted. Cedar Hollow had changed too. New families had moved in. Old ones had moved on. The town was bigger now, more prosperous, and while there were still people like Dorothy Carver who thrived on gossip and judgment, there were also more who didn't. People who saw Mara not as the invisible woman she'd once been, but as someone who mattered. Someone who'd built a life worth noticing. One afternoon, Mara was in town picking up supplies when a young woman approached her. She was maybe 20, with nervous eyes and work-worn hands. "Mrs. Rowan?" she said hesitantly. "Yes?" "I'm sorry to bother you. I heard about what you did, standing up to the consortium, and I wanted to say thank you." Mara blinked. "You don't need to thank me." "I do." The woman's voice wavered. "My family. We were about to sell. We were scared and we didn't think we had a choice. But then we heard about you and the others, and it gave us courage to stay. So thank you." She walked away before Mara could respond, leaving her standing there with a lump in her throat. Because that was the thing about courage, Mara realized. It wasn't something you had or didn't have. It was something you built piece by piece by refusing to give up even when everything told you to. And sometimes, your courage gave other people permission to find theirs. Tut. Rose was 15 when she asked the question Mara had been dreading. They were working in the garden together, the late afternoon sun warm on their backs. When Rose said, "Mama, why did it take you so long to marry Papa?" Mara's hand stilled in the dirt. "What do you mean?" "You were older when you got married, and you'd known each other for years before that. I just wondered why you waited." Mara sat back on her heels, considering her answer. Rose was old enough now to understand complicated things, old enough to deserve the truth. "Because I didn't think I deserved him," Mara said finally. Rose frowned. "That's stupid." "Rose, it is." Her daughter's voice was fierce. "You're amazing. Why wouldn't you deserve him?" "Because I'd spent so long being invisible that I forgot I was worth seeing." Mara met her daughter's eyes. "Your grandmother, my mother, she needed me. And that was good, in a way. It gave me purpose. But when she died, I didn't know who I was without someone needing me. And I definitely didn't think anyone would want me just for being me. But Papa did. He did. And it terrified me." "Why?" "Because love makes you vulnerable. It means letting someone see all the parts of you that you've tried to hide. And I didn't know if I was brave enough for that." Rose was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she said, "Are you glad you did it anyway, even though you were scared?" "More than anything." "Good." Rose turned back to the garden. "Because if you hadn't, I wouldn't be here." It was such a simple statement, but it hit Mara like a punch to the chest. Because Rose was right. Every choice Mara had made, Every moment of fear and doubt and hesitation had led to this, to her daughter, to her son, to the life she'd built with Caleb. And she wouldn't trade any of it, it told me. The years continued their relentless march. James grew into a young man who looked more like Caleb every day, tall and steady, with that same quiet strength. Rose became a force of nature, sharp and opinionated, and utterly fearless. They both left eventually, the way children do, to build lives of their own. Rose married a rancher from the next county over, a man who matched her fire with his own, and gave Mara 3 grandchildren who visited every summer. James went east to study agriculture, came back with a degree and ideas about land management that made Caleb both proud and exasperated, and eventually took over running the ranch. And through it all, Mara and Caleb grew old together, not gracefully, not without struggle. Caleb's back gave him trouble. Mara's hands ached from arthritis. They moved slower, tired easier, bickered over things that didn't matter, and laughed at jokes only they understood. But they stayed. Through every season, every hardship, every moment of joy and sorrow, they stayed. Mara was 68 when Caleb got sick. It started small, a cough that wouldn't go away, fatigue that sleep didn't fix. By the time they got him to a doctor in the bigger town 2 days' ride away, the diagnosis was grim. Months, the doctor said. Maybe a year if you're lucky. Caleb took the news with the same steady calm he'd brought to everything else in his life. But Mara felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. "We'll fight it," she said when they were alone. "Mara, we'll fight it. There has to be something." "There's not." Caleb took her hand. "And I'm not going to spend whatever time I have left chasing miracles." "So what? You're just giving up." "I'm not giving up. I'm accepting." He pulled her close. "I've had a good life. A better life than I ever thought I'd get, and I got to spend it with you. That's enough." "It's not enough for me," Mara said, and she started crying. Caleb held her while she sobbed, his grip still strong despite everything. And when she finally quieted, he said, "I need you to promise me something." "What?" "When I'm gone, and I will be gone, Mara, sooner rather than later, I need you to keep living, not just surviving, living. I don't know how to do that without you." "Yes, you do." His voice was firm. "You did it before you met me, and you'll do it after. You're stronger than you think." "I don't want to be strong. I want you." "I know." He pressed his lips to her forehead. "But you'll do it anyway. For me." That's. Caleb lasted 7 months. 7 months of slow decline, of good days and bad days, of watching the man she loved fade a little more each week. The whole family came. Rose and her husband and the grandchildren, James and his new wife, neighbors and friends, and people Mara barely knew but who'd been touched by Caleb's life in some way. He faced it all with grace, with humor even, cracking jokes when the pain allowed, telling stories about the early days of the ranch, making sure everyone knew how much they mattered to him. And when the end finally came, it was quiet. Mara was beside him, holding his hand, and he looked at her with eyes that were still sharp despite everything. "I love you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I love you too. 15 years wasn't long enough. 50 wasn't long enough." He smiled. "No, but it was good." It was. And then he closed his eyes, and he was gone. The grief nearly broke her, not all at once, but in waves, relentless and overwhelming, hitting when she least expected it. She'd be doing something mundane, making coffee, feeding the chickens, and suddenly she'd remember that Caleb wasn't there to do it with her, and the loss would slam into her all over again. Rose and James tried to help, tried to convince her to move in with one of them, to let them take care of her. But Mara refused, because this ranch, this life, was hers and Caleb's. And as long as she could still work it, she would. So she stayed. She woke every morning to an empty bed and made herself get up anyway. She tended the animals and the garden and the 100 small tasks that kept the ranch running. She sat on the porch in the evenings and talked to Caleb like he was still there, telling him about her day, asking his opinion on things she already knew the answer to. And slowly, so slowly, she almost didn't notice, the grief became bearable. Not gone, never gone, but manageable. Mara was 73 when she finally understood what Caleb had been trying to tell her. She was sitting on the porch watching the sunset, surrounded by grandchildren who'd come to visit, and Rose was telling a story about something James had done as a boy. The kids were laughing, and the sound filled the air like music, and Mara felt something shift inside her. This was what he'd meant. This was what, not moving on, not forgetting, but living anyway. Finding joy in the moments that were left, in the family they'd built, in the legacy they'd created together. "Grandma?" One of the younger grandchildren tugged on her sleeve. "Are you crying?" "Just a little, sweetheart." "Are you sad?" Mara looked around at the faces of her family, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried pieces of her and Caleb forward into the future, and smiled. "No," she said, "I'm not sad." And she meant it. Mara lived another 12 years. Long enough to see James's children grow and start families of their own. Long enough to watch Rose become a grandmother herself. Long enough to know that the life she and Caleb had built would continue long after she was gone. When she finally passed, peacefully, in her sleep, in the same bed she'd shared with Caleb for decades, the whole community mourned. Not because she was famous or powerful or any of the things the world usually values, but because she'd mattered, because she'd taken a life that had been defined by invisibility and transformed it into something undeniable, because she'd stood up when it mattered, loved fiercely when it was hard, and built something lasting in a world that too often valued only the temporary. Her funeral was packed. People came from all over, neighbors and friends, people whose lives she'd touched in ways both big and small. Rose gave the eulogy, her voice strong despite the tears, and she told the story of her mother's life not as a tragedy, but as a triumph. "My mother spent the first half of her life believing she didn't matter," Rose said, "that she was invisible, that the world had moved on without her, and always would. But she was wrong. She mattered more than she ever knew. And the proof is all of us standing here today, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who exist because she chose courage over fear. Because she let herself be loved. Because she built something that will outlast all of us." And in the end, that was Mara Ellison Rowan's legacy. Not perfection, not fame, not even happiness, though there'd been plenty of that too, but the simple, radical act of refusing to disappear, of claiming space in a world that had tried to erase her, of building a life worth living and a love worth fighting for. She'd started as a woman the world forgot, and she'd ended as someone impossible to ignore. Not because she'd changed who she was at the core, but because she'd finally let herself be seen, and in being seen, in allowing Caleb to love her, in building a family, in standing up to those who tried to take what was hers, she'd discovered the truth she'd been searching for her whole life. She'd never been too late. She'd just been waiting for the moment courage met opportunity. And when that moment came, she'd seized it with both hands and built something beautiful from the broken pieces. That was the lesson Mara's life taught. Not that love fixes everything or that courage erases fear, but that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be found. Let yourself be known. Let yourself take up space in a world that tells you you're not worth it, because you are worth it. Even when you can't see it yourself. Even when the world has taught you to shrink and hide and disappear. Even when every voice in your head says you're not enough, you are. And the moment you start believing it, the moment you let someone else see the truth of who you are, everything changes. Not all at once, not perfectly, not without struggle, but it changes. And that change, however small, however hard won, is enough to build a life on. Mara had proven that, in a harsh frontier town, in a life that had tried to break her, in the face of every doubt and fear and moment of weakness, she'd proven it, and her legacy, written in the faces of the family she'd built, in the land she'd fought to keep, in the story that would be told and retold for generations, was this: you are never too late, you are never too broken, you are never too invisible to matter. You just have to be brave enough to let the world see you, and when you do, when you finally step into the light and claim the space you deserve, the world will never be able to forget you again.